What does it mean for work to have meaning? It can mean a lot of things, actually, and it can show up differently for everyone. But when it shows up, the effect is undeniable. With meaningful work, employees are 7 times more engaged, 64% more fulfilled on the job, and 69% less likely to leave the company. Those numbers come from today's guest on the DesuckifyWork Podcast, Tamara Myles. Tamara is an author, consultant, speaker, and researcher who is currently working on her next book, More Than a Paycheck: How Leaders Can Answer the Growing Demand for Meaning at Work, set to be published in early 2025. During the show, we talked about the 10 principles of highly meaningful work and how they don't just apply to office-based careers. They're pretty universal. We spoke about how one of those principles, onboarding, is so underappreciated and yet so critical. And we touched on one of my favorite areas, the importance of recognizing possibility and nurturing potential in everyone. We could do a whole show on just that alone. Tamara is incredibly smart, thoughtful, and 1,000,000,000% committed to helping people find meaning in their work. You should listen to her. So let's do that, shall we? Okay, Tamara Myles, welcome to the DesuckifyWork Podcast.
Thank you. I'm so delighted to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you here. I mean, I think where you spend a lot of your time professionally just syncs up so nicely with what I'm trying to do to make the world of work better. I think you have a really nice focus. So with that said, do you mind giving us a little bit of your background of what you do for work and a little bit of how you came to be doing it?
Yeah, sure. I would love to. So I wear like 3 hats primarily.
Okay.
There's like 3 main things that I focus on. One is my consulting business, where I do a lot of training, facilitating, speaking on workplace well-being, on meaning at work, productivity. I also write books. My first book was published back in 2014, and I just finished writing the manuscript for my second book, which will be published in early 2025.
Nice.
And then I help leaders consult with leaders on work design, how to actually design systems that enable work to be better for people to thrive. So that's my business hat. Then my other hat is at the University of Pennsylvania. I am an instructor in the Masters of Applied Positive Psychology program.
Okay.
I also am a senior trainer for the Penn Resilience program. And I do research out of the Positive Psychology Center there.
Okay.
And then my biggest hat, I think, is being a mom of 3 high school aged teenagers.
Oh,
So
wow. Yeah.
yeah.
I imagine that takes a pretty big hat. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's really fun and very deeply meaningful.
Yeah. I can only imagine. I don't have kids, but I always, that age, I mean, I can only imagine the fun of seeing people transitioning into adults.
Yeah.
It just must be such a wild experience.
It's incredible. Yeah. It's bittersweet in a way because you see
I can see that.
a whole phase ending, right? But it's so exciting for this other phase.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, there's a lot of good stuff, obviously, that you covered in terms of what you do. And I think we'll touch on a bit of all of that. But I think this idea of meaning at work is one that really resonates and really feels worth exploring a little bit, because on the surface, I think people can hear that and go, well, yeah, of course. And then I think the question becomes, how does that happen? And is it available to everyone? Right? Because I think some people might be like, well, if I'm a doctor or certain types of jobs, like meaning it comes naturally. But if I work at the local paper company, how could I do that? How could I find meaning? So maybe at just a high level, can any job bring meaning, and how can it?
That's such a great question. And it's exactly why I went to graduate school, right? I was really curious about that. in my own experience, before I started my business, I actually grew up in advertising,
Hmm.
and in working, in account management and in different agencies and different leaders, and sometimes doing the exact same work, it felt really deeply meaningful. And
Hmm.
I was excited to go to work. I had some great ideas. I was heard, and people cared about me and what I did on the weekend. And
Hmm.
then in another agency, it was the opposite.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I didn't feel like my opinions mattered. I was just completely overworked. And so I was really interested to find, like, in the same industry, same kinds of accounts, like, what is the difference? Can any job
Hmm.
be meaningful? And so what research finds, including my own research, is that yes, every job can, and I really believe
Hmm.
should be meaningful.
Nice.
And meaning, from my research, comes from three main sources. And my research partner and colleague and friend Wes Adams and I created a framework that we call the three C's,
Hmm.
that describes these sources. So the first one is community. So
Okay.
meaning comes from feeling a sense of belonging to our
Hmm.
workplace community, right? So
Nice.
having people who care about us, not just as somebody who produces great work, but as
Hmm.
individuals, right? Having
Yeah.
friends at work, that's
Hmm.
really important.
Hmm.
Then the second C is contribution. And
Hmm.
that's what you talked about when you talked about surgeons or people who work in, nonprofit, social work,
Hmm.
social impact work. And that is what people mostly think of when they think of meaningful work. They're thinking about
Right.
purpose. But
Hmm.
even having a strong purpose is not enough to make work meaningful, because a lot of
Hmm.
surgeons sometimes lose the meaning of their work, or people in
Yeah.
social impact.
Hmm.
So we need to understand our contribution to that purpose, the
Hmm.
impact that we make. And
Right.
so I like to think about it as, like, our contribution activates purpose, right? So
Okay.
it's contribution. And
Hmm.
then the final C is challenge.
Hmm.
We need people who believe in us, believe in our
Hmm.
potential, and give us really meaningful and challenging opportunities to grow and expand our skills. So, community, contribution, and challenge, those three make work really meaningful.
Yeah. I mean, they all sort of make sense as soon as you say them. I'm like, yeah, I definitely need those three things. And I think it sort of begs the question, what keeps those things from showing up in a lot of workplaces? Because I'm sure you've found some of these numbers, but it feels like, based on just what I read and stuff, that a lot of people aren't finding meaning at work. So
That's, yeah.
what's blocking those three C's from being activated in a lot of places?
So, a few things we found. So, a huge part of community, the first C, a huge part of that is is this alignment between, who I am and what I value,
Hmm.
and the organization, and what does what are the values of the
Hmm.
organization, right? And people more and more are looking for that alignment.
Hmm.
And what we find is that like, that emerged across the three studies that we did, and as a critical ingredient for meaningful work is alignment between what the leader says and then what they do. So this,
Hmm.
like, idea of walking the talk and role
Hmm.
modeling is huge. It
Yeah.
is not sufficient. That alone doesn't make work meaningful, but
Hmm.
it kills meaning really fast. It is like the
Yeah.
single biggest destroyer of meaning around. And so that's one of the things, like, leaders who, and not to say, like, 100% of the time you're going to be perfect, because
Hmm.
sometimes there's conflict between two values. For example,
Sure.
when, let's say we're going to choose teamwork or client service, and
Hmm.
sometimes you have to work really hard and to the detriment of your people's well-being that day, for example,
Hmm.
because you're trying to deliver on something. But just being clear and explaining, being transparent
Hmm.
about why it is that you're making those decisions. So explaining the decisions is a really big part of that. So I think that that's one thing that gets in the way a lot that we see in our research is this lack of like walking the talk, or one of our clients calls it the say-do gap.
I like that. And I've definitely experienced that gap. And it makes me wonder, like, what's driving that behavior, right? I mean, you talk about transparency, and I think, when I've been on some leadership teams, there's debate about that, right? Like, how much should we reveal about the nitty gritty of what we're doing and the reasons behind it? Is it too much information? Does it put a burden on teams to know some of those things? So how do you consult with clients that you work with on that area of what is the best way to keep that gap tight and to be transparent in a way that doesn't put too much on the folks who are doing the work day to day?
What do you mean by putting too much on the folks that are doing the work?
Fear is like, if we tell them that we need to do this because I've had conversations with a client who is not sure that we're going to be their partner by the end of the year, something like that. So as a leader, part of you wants to say, I want you to know so that we're all in this. And then a part of you may want to go, that might be a burden for somebody to bear where they don't feel like they can do much about it. And so then is that information helping them? So that often is the battle with the transparency thing, is you think you're protecting the interest of your people. And I guess the question I would have is, where do you fall on those kinds of things? Like, do you think it's better to reveal that information and then figure out how to coach the team around that? Or are there times where it makes sense to withhold something?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I am trying to think of examples, from my interviews and the organizations I work with. And, there's some that are on the extreme, like one of their values, so HubSpot, they're a tech company based in Cambridge, but they're global, and they are one of the organizations we studied. So they're an exemplar organization. They work really hard to treat their people well, to have a culture of well-being and meaning. And one of their values is transparency. So that they really live and breathe that. And so they're probably like the most extreme example in the organization we study, where they let employees access their financial data at every level, and so they're fully transparent.
Yeah.
Some other organizations, are not that transparent and kind of try to toe the line a little bit and find where that line is. And I would say you can be vulnerable and transparent without having to reveal everything.
Yeah.
Right. And so, if let's say you are at risk of losing an account and you need your people to work extra for a week, right?
Yeah.
As somebody who might be that person working the extra long hours, would you prefer to just say, hey, just work extra, we need this done for this week?
Yeah.
Or, would you prefer if somebody said, hey, we're having a lot of discussions. We really want to ensure that we keep this client. They're one of our, longest term clients. We have to refresh our relationship with them. We want to make sure we're delivering the highest quality service. We're pitching at the end of the week. Can we have all hands on deck?
Yeah.
What concerns, what ideas do you have? What have you learned about your conversations with them over the past week that will, and so like bringing people under the fold, maybe without saying like they told us they're firing us, but
yeah. I think I lean towards that personally because I like to know, and I think as a leader, I think sometimes it's like there needs to be some coaching / training on how to deliver and communicate weighty information in a way that empowers your team
Mhm.
versus like scares the crap out of them, right? Because I think like you
Exactly.
can get to the like, oh my God, hair on fire,
Right.
we're doomed. And then your whole team falls under that versus this is the reality of our business. Sometimes clients, show up and say, we want to consider some other things, but we also want you to look at the business maybe differently and see what you guys can bring. Who's with us? So sometimes it's just as simple as communication and how
Exactly.
you show up,
It's like
right?
how you're framing the conversation,
Mm-hmm.
because honestly, like humans have like a big built-in BS detector, you know what I
Yes,
mean?
they
And
do.
so it's
Yeah.
worse if you're trying to do like the whole toxic positivity thing and
Mm-hmm.
pretend like nothing to see here, all's
Yeah.
good. Like people know. And then you have the conversations in the meeting, and then you have the conversations about the meeting that are happening in the
Mm-hmm.
hallways. And that's not conducive to meeting at work.
Yeah. No, I get that. I think that BS detector is, I think people underestimate sometimes just how strong that is.
Yeah.
And that, like, I think that should probably push us to be as transparent as we can be, but also be as um, uplifting as we can be with the way we deliver that information and show people a way through whatever the
Yes.
challenge is so that they're not stuck.
100%. And I think, one way to do that is to lean on values. I mean,
Mm,
that came up again and again.
yeah.
Whether hopefully it's the organizational values that are developed and are more than words on the wall. It's part
Hmm.
of the language, and people make decisions and know how to act based on those values. And
Hmm.
so, if you're leaning on those and making decisions based on those values, it becomes a little easier, not easy, but a
Yeah.
little easier to
Hmm.
explain the decisions and be transparent when you
Yeah.
tie
No,
it back to the values.
I think that's a great point. I know I've coached a few people who when they start to really dig into the values, they find ways then to express those values even through the requests, like this really supports our value of X, or recognizing somebody for doing something that supports the values, and not just in private, but maybe in a way that goes, that other people can see, oh, this is how I do it. This is how I show up with those values. And what I find interesting about the values conversation is there are some companies, and I know your research really focused on these exemplar companies who probably, at the very least, had clearly stated values and did their best to live by them.
Those were actually criteria to participate in our
Oh,
study,
okay.
so all the
Yeah,
companies did
all of
have
them
that.
did.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So when I think back on my career, and you mentioned advertising, and that's where my career has been. What I've noticed is, I would say there's probably at least half the places I've worked, I have no idea what their values were.
Right,
Like they didn't even come up. And so now you may be interpreted, you defaulted to, well, I guess their values are some mix of, you know, work us to the bone and be bad at communicating, because that's what I'm experiencing. Do you notice that, like, in people you talk to, like, if you don't clearly state, articulate, and help people connect to those values, that there's sort of this vacuum that just gets filled with whatever's showing up day to day?
100%. Yes,
Yeah.
because you know culture exists whether you state it and talk about it and are
Yeah.
intentional about creating the kind of culture you want or
Mm-hmm.
not, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so ideally it's built intentionally around shared values and then behaviors that that are driven from these values. But you're absolutely right. If there's no effort behind doing that work and then reinforcing it every day in every action in every meeting and every conversation,
Mm-hmm.
then they will emerge, and they'll be what gets talked about in the water cooler for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I just wonder if some people don't realize that, because you think on some level that would be obvious, but I think not everybody recognizes that, like, people are talking and experiencing some kind of culture and values no matter what. And therefore, wouldn't it behoove you to
Right.
make the effort, make the investment, and And it connects me to some things that I think you mentioned. I don't know whether it's on your site or I watched some of the videos that you've done or podcast episodes you've done. There's two stats that show up that demonstrate the importance of meaningful work and really showing up this way. And one is, you said, meaningful work makes people 69% less likely to leave a company. Mm-hmm. And I think certainly in the world of advertising, where turnover is like a third every year, my God, that number should jump out at people. And then, I think you use this phrase, meaning is the new money, or somebody uses that phrase. Mm-hmm. And you said something like each employee who feels they are doing meaningful work brings an extra like $10,000 worth of value to a company. So those to me feel like slam dunk cases for creating meaning at work. And yet not everybody is making this investment. What do you think is blocking them from taking that step?
I think that there has been a shift in the right direction, mm-hmm. right? So I think it's hard to organizational transformation and culture change, is not like overnight quick work. It's not, mm-hmm. It just takes time. It takes effort. It takes attention. Mm-hmm. And we're all busy, leaders. Everybody's busy with their day-to-day with trying to just get through their to-do list and email mm-hmm. and all the stuff that we all know about.
Point. Yeah.
And so I think because of that, so Laurie Santos, who's a Yale happiness professor, and she has a podcast and mm-hmm. a Coursera course and everything. And she calls this gap between knowing and doing the G.I. Joe fallacy, right? Because G.I. Joe, I guess at the end of the episodes, they used to say, now you know, and knowing is half the battle. And she says that knowing is actually much less than half the battle. And so I think this data you talked about, and there's tons of other data. So the data mm-hmm. has been out there for decades.
Yeah.
And I think there's two reasons why it hasn't been executed on yet, right? One is because meaningful work is great and it's important. Great. I'm convinced. How do I do it? So it's been lacking some kind of actionable framework of leadership practices. Mm-hmm. And then two, I think there hasn't been culturally, globally, a shift that was strong enough, like a tipping point to demand that. And I think that both of these problems, are kind of being solved. There's a solution out to both. One, I think the pandemic was this huge tipping point, right? Where people had the chance to step back and question their relationship to work a little bit, right? Because once everything halted and we went home and we kind of stepped off from our rut and our routine, we saw things with clear eyes. And so people ask, what do I want from work? What does my job do? Does it even matter what I do? And I want it to matter. And then on top of that, Gen Z has entered the workforce in large numbers, and they really, really want values alignment. They want meaningful work. I just wrote an article recently on LinkedIn called The Meaning Blind Spot, pulling together data from a ton of different research that has been published in the last year or two about, leaders think that people are leaving because they want more money or more perks, and people are saying, I want meaningful work. Yeah. And so there's this bit of a gap, but I think that gap is closing. And then the second one, the having practical tools and leadership practices is what my research has been doing, for the past 3 years. And we have a suite of practices that we found that really do increase people's sense of meaning at work. And I'll say, it's not if you think about the people you love the most, right? So think about, what do you want for them? What do you want for your siblings, your parents, your spouse, whoever? So what do you want for them?
Oh God. I mean, happiness is such a generic term, but a sense of happiness, of value, a sense of connection to other people in the world around them. I think maybe a sense of peace with the way their lives are, that they feel at home in themselves. You know, I think those are the things that show up immediately for me. Yeah.
Yeah, for me too. And I think
Mhm.
most people, that I ask this question to in workshops
Yeah.
or in conversations say very similar things.
Hmm.
What people don't say is, I want them to make a lot of money and have good benefits. That's what I want. And then what they also don't say is, I hope that they are, that they're not depressed, and I hope
Hmm.
that they're not anxious.
Yeah.
Like, you don't hope for the not bad. You want the
Hmm.
good, right? And
Yeah.
so I really believe, like, it's not even enough for work to not suck. That's
Hmm.
not enough.
I agree. Yeah.
Like, we need to aim higher. Like,
Hmm.
workplaces should be engines of well-being. They
Hmm.
should really contribute, not just to getting us to neutral.
Yeah.
And so the skills of um alleviating suckiness
Hmm.
or mental illness, for example, are very different from the
Hmm.
skills of building thriving,
Mm.
right? And
Yeah.
so there's two sets of skills, and both of them are important.
Hmm.
Both of them are important, but it's the minimizing the negative is only half of the equation, right? And
Yeah.
so positive psychology really looks at, how do we build more of the positive? And
Mm.
so at work, I believe that building of the positive comes from work that's meaningful, because when
Hmm.
you look at data on studies, about meaningful work, it
Hmm.
leads to all the things that leaders care about. So
Hmm.
productivity,
Hmm.
retention, engagement. So
Hmm.
meaningful work is the upstream factor that
Hmm.
leads to the outcomes that leaders care about.
Yeah, and that's an interesting note, because I do think we tend to think about the results, right? The lack of engagement, the people flying out the door, um, and you're putting band-aids on those things with like
Right.
perks or whatever, those kinds of things, thinking that's going to solve it, versus going further upstream and going, people are craving meaning. People are craving um, a sense that what they do for 8+ hours out of the day matters, and it connects to who they are, right? I mean, that's the thing that always just sort of blows my mind when people are dismissive of the idea that work can or should be meaningful. It's like, this is almost half our waking lives is
Yes.
work. So why shouldn't it at least not be terrible? And that's like, but why shouldn't it be a chance for us to express ourselves and to find ways to bring the best parts of ourselves out into the world? Because we don't have that many other opportunities to do that. This is one of the main avenues for that for us. So I love that you're focusing on this, and I love, you talked about how the research led to some very concrete tools. And I think, what I noticed, you talk about, I think it's the 10 principles of highly meaningful work. And I really love these, because I think even you mentioned in maybe one of your talks about this, like, they're not some crazy thing that only like 1% of companies can do. Like, you look at them and you go, we can all do this. Right. I mean, I think, you talked a little bit about this, but just the notion of like hiring people who care about achieving the same thing as you do, like that's that
Right.
values thing. Um, how, how can you, how can you get to that in the interview process reasonably quickly? How do you find people are able to find that connection in that process?
So in the best organizations that we studied, they
Mm-hmm.
have a values interview
Hmm.
that is separate from the skills based interview, right?
Okay.
And so usually it can maybe somebody in HR that's more focused on culture,
Mm-hmm.
and they ask behavioral interviewing questions
Mm-hmm.
about a time when something, for example. So one of the one of the organizations we studied is Zappos, and
Mm-hmm.
they have, very famous for their culture.
Mm-hmm.
They actually have a consulting branch that helps other
Oh, okay.
organizations. They did. I don't know if they still do now that they're
Yeah.
part of Amazon, but one of their 10 values, and they have a very clear values interview process actually. And what they told us is, let's say we have an engineer who has the exact skills we need, and we need to fill this position right away.
Mm-hmm.
The team loves their skills. They're going to help us get us to the next level.
Mm-hmm.
But they fail. If there's any red flags on their values interview, we don't hire them no matter what.
Mm.
So one of their values, well, their main value is to live and deliver wow, right? So they're all
Mm-hmm.
about wow.
Yeah.
But one of their quirky values is to be fun and a little weird,
Oh, I
right?
like that. Yeah.
Which is nice. It's like,
Yeah.
part of their culture and their personality. And so
Mm-hmm.
they ask questions like, oh, tell me, how did you make your past work environment fun?
Yeah.
What's something weird that you like to do?
Mm.
So, things like that. And so you get
Yeah.
to that. And then not only having questions that are values based and behavioral. So you're asking, oh, tell me about a time when. So
Mm-hmm.
you're trying to get to the behaviors that they exhibited, right, to
Mm-hmm.
match your values. But then also having some kind of scorecard where you measure their responses,
Mm-hmm.
just so you can remove some of the bias,
Yeah.
right? There's
Mm-hmm.
so much bias in interview, and we
Mm-hmm.
tend to like people that are similar to us. We tend
Yeah.
to, right? Oh, we both have kids in high school. Oh my God, your kid
Mm-hmm.
wrestles my. So
Yeah.
like to have that
That's great.
scorecard,
Mm-hmm.
um, and then really, really be clear about what are your guidelines. And when, most of the organizations in our study that are these exemplar organizations will not hire someone if they exhibit red flags on their
I
values.
love that.
Yeah.
I feel like some places will talk the talk, right? Like these are our values, but then like when circumstances squeeze you,
Mm-hmm.
um, it can be really easy to jump off the values bus and start to just go to the like, I need somebody now. And so I love that there are organizations who stand by that even when somebody's probably screaming in their ear, I need somebody.
Right.
And it's like, we will get you somebody. But imagine what happens if we hire that person who doesn't share our values. We can't unwind that very easily, you know?
Yeah. And,
So,
and and who you let in, to your organization really shapes the
mhm,
culture, right? So if you start
so
making
much.
exceptions over
Mhm.
time,
Yeah.
it changes things, and it
Hmm.
it just takes like one bad apple. There's a lot of research on the
Absolutely.
influence of like one toxic worker
Hmm.
in poisoning the well. So
Yeah.
it's important. And gosh, we have so many stories. Chick-fil-A was one of our organizations. They're a super
Hmm.
values driven organization that I'm not saying like I agree with their values or,
Right.
but they're super values
They're
driven
they're
and
driven that
an
way. Yeah.
exemplar. And they were very careful about who is allowed to open a franchise and be a franchisee.
Yeah.
The franchisee goes through a year-long interview process,
Wow.
including often their family members are interviewed. They really try to get to that person's character and like who they are, right?
That's
So we tend
fascinating.
to hire people based on what they know, right? What do they
Hmm.
know? But based on character, it's a much more long-term play.
Yeah. I feel like, you know, again, when we talk about culture, in a lot of places we'll say, there's a lot of value around culture. Um, and what I wonder for some companies who say that is how can you get them to realize, and maybe I don't know if there's any quantifiable numbers you can attach to the value of culture, because that I think is where you might get people to defend their culture the way they might defend some other parts of their business, whether it's the financial side or some of the policies and processes that they defend. It's like if you allow that culture to weaken, its impact is not simply people might be grumbly at work. It's like productivity goes down. People aren't reaching their potential. Turnover goes up, and there's a literal cost to that. Have you ever helped anyone with that? Connect those dots at all? Is that part of what you do?
Yeah, I do a lot of culture transformation work
Mm-hmm.
with organizations. It's slow work, depending,
Yeah.
especially on the size of the organization.
Mm-hmm.
And the value of it is kind of a living and breathing thing, right? So
Mm-hmm.
people feel better coming to work, they have better conversations,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes difficult conversations, but you have the psychological safety to
Yeah.
address issues and not bury them, and a
Mm-hmm.
much more open kind of culture. It keeps people there longer. So
Mm-hmm.
definitely a reduction in turnover. So we can measure some of the outcomes,
Yeah.
right? That
Mm-hmm.
since we started working together, so we measure some of these very concrete metrics,
Mm-hmm.
and we also measure. We often will administer our survey for meaningful work, leadership practices that lead to
Mm-hmm.
meaningful work, and we can measure that over time.
Oh, cool.
So at the start, before we started working together, these were the measures, and like 6 months in, a year in, and so
Mm-hmm.
we do have data that
Yeah.
supports. And then also there was a study that was published last year by researchers from Oxford and MIT and other universities,
Mm-hmm.
and it's the first study, which is super exciting, to link happiness, so well-being, greater well-being at work, with higher productivity.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been a lot of correlational studies, like, yeah, when
Okay.
people are happier at work, they tend to be more productive. But this was the first study that showed like causal
Oh, wow.
evidence of that.
That's awesome.
And so it's really exciting, and I think it's going to open the doors for even more studies of that
Mm-hmm.
nature to be done. And so even if you're a leader who does not care at all about your people's well-being,
Mm-hmm.
whether or not they're happy, whether or not they're experiencing meaning at work, and I
Mm-hmm.
only care about money, that's
Yeah.
all I care about,
Yeah.
then well-being is your biggest lever. Like, it
Mm-hmm.
is the best way for you to reach the single outcome that you care about, if that is money or
Yeah.
higher productivity.
Yeah. And I think there are people like that for sure.
Yeah.
And then I think people tend to fall on a spectrum, and depending on, where you fall, like you're at least going to be like, all right, I need to know, like, if I'm going to invest time and money in some of these efforts, there is a payoff. So that's a wonderful thing. And I think, you mentioned like well-being is your best lever. And I think about, right, not even just right now, but I would say in the last 20 years or so, a lot of businesses have been kind of operating from a like growth is hard to come by mindset. So that's why you see so many times where there's efforts to cut cost and cut cost and cut cost. And what I see in this connection between well-being and things like productivity and financial benefit for the company is this might be a way of reframing your thinking of like, my only option isn't to cut costs. I can actually invest in my people. And even if that may not unlock, um, the growth in the way I traditionally think about it, investing in, equipment or whatever, like it becomes a new framing for achieving growth. And has anybody started to notice that in your experience?
I spend so much time with exemplar organizations who have
Yeah.
noticed that so long ago.
Yeah.
But the organizations that I work with that are working towards becoming exemplar have noticed
Mm-hmm.
that shift.
Yeah.
One word of caution, though, like I was being cheeky when I said, like, even if you only care about this thing,
Yeah.
we, like I said earlier, the BS detectors, like we also know, like, if you're just doing this to get more out of me too. And if it's
Yeah.
not, you know what I mean? If it's not,
Oh, I get that.
if
Yeah.
it's not true, if you're like,
Hmm.
oh, here, I care about your well-being, but like really, I
Hmm.
just want more productivity out of you. Like that doesn't work.
Yeah,
There's this whole like dark side, to
I get
meaningful
that.
work, which
Hmm.
is exploitation. Like I'm going to
Yeah.
give you work that's really meaningful. So the seminal study on that was done with zookeepers,
Mm.
right? People who find their work deeply, deeply meaningful. They're taking care of often species that are, at risk of being extinct, and
Hmm.
they love these animals, and they are underpaid, and
Mm.
they overworked, and so
Yeah.
um, invest in well-being is good business, but do it because it's a worthwhile pursuit in itself.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. I can see how it could be turned into exploitation with the wrong mindset
Yeah.
behind it. And I also do think like if you're just sort of miming the efforts versus actually like getting yourself into those efforts and believing in
Exactly.
them, it won't pass the sniff test for a lot of
Right.
people. And so those benefits won't actually show up because I have to
Exactly.
imagine those benefits are deeply connected to our psychology. Um, and we have to actually feel it, not just
Yeah.
simply see like, oh, we have a well-being program at work. Like we need to
Exactly.
feel the effort behind it. Yeah.
100%. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, I often have people do an exercise where I ask them to think about a time in their career
Mm-hmm.
where work felt really meaningful, like
Mm-hmm.
one specific point in time,
Mm.
right? I don't know if you have a story that you can share.
It's funny for me because when I think of examples where work felt meaningful, it really has nothing to do with like the particular project I was working on. It has to do with the people I was working with, feeling supported, feeling like when we got through that project, that there would be a moment to celebrate, a moment to recognize, and that throughout the process, you felt, and I know you talk about some of these things like autonomy, like the fact that you were trusted to take on your part of that job and not be micromanaged. There's a word that I don't know if you use this, but it shows up for me as like immersion. That like I'm included. I'm deeply a part of the work. I've had those experiences. Fortunately, in my career, I've had them a lot, but it really starts with the leadership sort of bestowing that sense of trust on you and being alongside of you and knowing that they're alongside of you more so than oh it was a project that saved the whales and therefore it felt meaningful to me.
Exactly, exactly,
Mhm.
and you're definitely not alone in these experiences and the words
Mm.
that you use to describe
Yeah.
them. We that was part of our research. One of the questions we asked every
Hmm.
person we interviewed. It's a question we ask most workshops we do,
Hmm.
and the answers always kind of come back to these things you talked about too. It was about the people, and I
Hmm.
felt trusted, and I had the autonomy to do this, and
Hmm.
somebody believed in me,
Hmm.
and I was so connected. And so even if it is because you ended up saving the world,
Yeah.
or with something, but it's because somebody showed you, gave you that opportunity, but then
Hmm.
connected the dots to the impact. I mean, I'll share,
Yeah.
my sister called me yesterday. My sister's a dentist. She has a practice, and she also teaches cosmetic dentistry. And
Hmm.
she told me that she got a note um, in the mail, and it was this beautiful note from a student who is a few years behind her. So my sister also has 3 kids, 3 teenagers,
Hmm.
and this woman is pregnant now, so she's just about to start a family, and she
Hmm.
started her practice a few years ago. And she sent my sister this beautiful note that just said, I have learned so much from you, not just in class, but also about how to manage, running your own dental practice with being a mom. I was so
Mm,
nervous about how things were going to change, and you're such a role model. And I mean, it was
wow.
such a beautiful note. My sister was
Hmm.
crying when she
Yeah.
she just, and so it's about that. Like, sure, she
Hmm.
gets meaning from going and teaching the class, which she loves, and she gets
Hmm.
me. But gosh, getting that note, right?
Yeah.
And knowing the impact, knowing how what you do matters is
Hmm.
huge, right?
That's
And
so
being,
huge.
yeah.
Yeah, that's lovely. I love that story. And I feel like it's almost like when you write those kinds of notes, you're almost not aware of how deep that impact is. I mean, I got an email the other day from somebody that I've talked to in some coaching programs that I'm a part of. And just out of the blue, she wrote me like 3 sentences, basically just saying how much she appreciated this podcast and like that some of the thoughts that come up during the podcast really just made her think about things differently. And she was so grateful for that. And I was like, so I was sharing with my wife, and I'm like, this is like one of the most awesome notes I've ever received in my life. And, you know, it's just, it's hard to express like how important that is to make you feel seen. I mean, that phrase almost gets overused at times. I feel seen, but it's like, that's why like you're showing up to try to have those kinds of impacts. So if one person just confirms that you're connecting to them in some way, it's like it becomes like fuel. Like it's like I can live off of that for a long time. And it's a good reminder for those of us. So when we do feel those things from somebody, to just take a few minutes to share that note just doesn't have to be long.
No,
How
doesn't.
valuable it is to people.
Yeah, I mean, gratitude and the gratitude letter is one of the most well-researched
Mm,
interventions in positive psychology, and
yeah.
it has so many great results. And again, it doesn't cost anything, maybe a
Hmm.
little bit of time, but
Yeah.
how often do we go about our days and we listen to a podcast and we're like, oh, that was a good idea or
Yeah.
whatever. And we
Hmm.
have the thoughts, we feel the gratitude, but we
Hmm.
don't express it. And how are
Yeah.
people going to know if you don't
Hmm.
tell them? Right. And so
Yeah.
that's like such an easy place to start.
Yeah.
So positive feedback, recognition, just letting
Hmm.
people know the value they add
Hmm.
is huge to creating a sense of mattering.
Yeah. I mean, I think, God, there's so much good stuff there, and there's so much good stuff coming out of the research you talked about. I mean, I don't think we can get into all of those 10 points, but I think people should absolutely look them up because they're very practical. Like you can look at it and go, I can do this thing. I think the one that might surprise people the most is around orientation and onboarding,
Mm,
because I think, at least in my experience, the onboarding experience is usually pretty um, flat. You
mhm.
know, you might get something. Like I remember one place they gave me some flowers or something. I was like, oh, that's nice, But the organizations you've talked to, like they treat onboarding this the same way they might treat building a new product. I mean, it's like it's given all the care and love to create like something special. I think you said even sacred. There's rituals. What is it about that that adds to the sense of meaning at work, and why do you think that so many places sort of gloss over that process?
I mean, that I'm so glad you want to talk about this because it was a really unique finding from our research. And we
Mm-hmm.
had not seen before much research on meaningful work, the tie between onboarding and meaningful
Mm-hmm.
work. And it
Yeah.
emerged again and again and again in our study. And we were so excited. And it was one of our interviewees that actually used the term sacred moment. She
Mm.
said, at our organization, and that was Better Up, they do
Mm-hmm.
coaching, virtual
Yeah.
coaching at
Mm-hmm.
scale for organizations. And she told us, she's like, oh yeah, we view onboarding as a sacred moment in a new employee's life. They're
Wow.
joining us. It's as, it's kind of like a moment in time, like their wedding or,
Mm-hmm.
and so they really treat it like that special moment. And And the C that we put that practice under is community.
Yeah.
Because the practices that we found that they do really build community. And there's two main buckets of practices that make for a sacred moment onboarding.
Okay.
One is cultural assimilation, right? So you want to bring employees under the fold to your culture and your values and how things are done around here. You want them to master that, to have a sense of like, all right, I know how things are done around here. And then the other one is helping them build relationships right away, not just in their team, of course, with their manager and their team, but across the organization. And so for the cultural mastery practices include a lot of storytelling. Again, that was something that emerged in our study, that when we were coding the data, we were like, oh my goodness, like so much storytelling.
Yeah.
And we weren't expecting that, but in hindsight, it made total sense because you're talking about meaning, and meaning is all about the stories we tell ourselves and how we make meaning. How does something mean something? And so they really lean on storytelling, especially to tell the stories of the values. And so let's say one of the values is to be bold. Well, great. What does that mean here? And so having somebody say, all right, this is, one time I was pitching an idea to a client and I really wanted to lean into the value of be bold. And so instead of just presenting the pitch, like we did a whole skit and whatever, I'm just making this up, but
I get it.
like really telling the story of the value. And then also rituals. It can be as simple as, Googlers, like new Google employees getting the hat with the propeller on top. It's like a symbol of something, like a ritual there is infused with meaning. One organization, so Zappos, actually every new employee, no matter what level, becomes a customer service representative for a week because their main goal, they are a customer service company that sells shoes, right? Versus like a retail company. And so everybody went through that. It could be
That's awesome.
a little graduation ceremony, whatever it is. So coming up with rituals that I think it's Airbnb that has like a human tunnel and people run through it because it's like their values all about belonging to the world, right? So that's one. And then the other one is all about building relationships. And there's a few ways that people do that. One is by having cohorts on board together from across the organization, across locations, but also taking it a step further. So at Google, after the week-long onboarding, they make sure before they leave that they schedule meetings every 6 months or every 3 months with the other Nooglers to touch base. So it's kind of built into the system.
Cool.
So that, and then at BetterUp, they make a Slack channel for that onboarding cohort. And so they're in touch. And then every 6 months or so, they're like, oh, congrats on your 6-month anniversary. And so those are very simple. Organizations like Microsoft and others do the onboarding buddy program, right? Where you get paired with a buddy from a different department, maybe somebody across the organization. And that can be kind of like your first office friend, somebody where you call and like, oh my gosh, I can't figure out how to find that document. Like, can you help me? Do you know this person? I need to work with them and I've never met them. Can you introduce me? So little things like that. And do I have time to tell a story about that?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. So my family and I moved so I live in Massachusetts outside of Boston, and we used to live in a town about 45 minutes away from where we live now. And about 8 years ago, we moved to our current town. And we had 3 kids in elementary school at that time, right? So 5th, 4th, and 2nd grades. And it's one of those moments like in a parent's life that you're thinking, oh my goodness, this is a fork in the road moment. Either the kids are going to look back at this moment and be like, oh my God, our parents ruined our lives and they're going to be in therapy because of us, right? Or it's going to be like, oh, kids are resilient. It was fine. It was wonderful. It was great. So we were really nervous. And we knew, my husband and I, that the school would be a huge part of what made or break, making and breaking it for the kids, right?
Yeah.
The school would really matter. And we had done a ton of research, and we had picked this town, and we moved right before school started. And it was just like very stressful. As you can imagine, moving
Yeah.
is always stressful. And a week before school started, so the school had asked us to fill out a questionnaire about each kid so they could place them and all that.
Mm-hmm.
And then a week before school started, I got an email from the school principal. And she said, "Hi, welcome. I'd like to invite you and the kids for a private tour of the school before school starts. I want to show their classrooms and where they're going to be. They can ask me any questions." And I
Mm-hmm.
was like, "Oh, that's great." So we went and did the tour. And she was like really trying to get the kids to be comfortable and showed them, like, the school had like an indoor gym rock wall. And here's where you eat lunch and the recess, like all the things that the kids really care about.
Sure.
And, they wanted to know, how many recesses do we get? And like all the things. So they started to feel more comfortable. Like, all right, this was really great. So that we're not putting them on the bus that first day. At least we can visualize where they're going to be, and they have an idea, right? And so we were thanking her. And as we were leaving, she was like, "Oh, we have this program called the New Families Program here. So I have gone through your questionnaires for each of the kids, and I have found a student in their class that matches their interests and I think is going to be a good buddy for them. And so I've reached out to those families. So expect an email from those families. They're going to reach out, and I'm hoping that each kid can connect with their buddy before school starts. So they'll have a friendly face to sit with at lunch and in their classroom." Oh, I started crying.
Yeah.
Like, I cannot tell you how much that meant to us. And we went to the park. They each met their buddies, and they were the families that it was not just a lifeline for the kids, like for my husband and I, to have a family to be like, how do we sign up for soccer? And which one is the best dance, company around here? Or where do you buy, what's the best sushi restaurant? But then they also invited us to dinner and introduced us to other families. And one of the families, we're so close with them. We travel with them all the time. But, like just taking the time to read about them and learn who my kids are, right? Who they are, but then pair them with a buddy who knew, like, who was a good match for them. And just
Very
that extra
thoughtful.
step is so thoughtful. So when I was studying onboarding and hearing these stories, I was like, yeah, they treated that as a sacred moment. That was pretty much an onboarding program, right?
Yeah.
And they
Absolutely.
went that extra step, and it meant so much. I will never forget that. And I think that is the difference between a onboarding that's just paperwork and compliance and maybe some flowers,
Yeah.
and in a sacred moment onboarding.
Oh, wow. I think that's an amazing moment. And I think what I like about so much of what you're talking about in this in particular is it's very thoughtful, and you have to be very intentional about it. But when I peel it back and go, okay, how much time does it actually take? It's not a ton of time.
No.
It's just focused at time where you're bringing your sort of most thoughtful self to that moment where you're reading up on the kid and then kind of looking through and going, oh, this kid would be a great match, and thinking about those connections. It's like this much work for this much benefit. And I think what I also love about that, both there and in any onboarding, is it's not simply the new person or the new family or the new people who are benefiting from it, but by involving the team and other, or other families, you're reinforcing their investment and their love for this place, because they're getting a chance to be valued as somebody who gets to welcome somebody in and gets to be sort of standing up for and living and sharing the values of this new community that you're stepping into. So what a benefit to all parties. I got to imagine that impact is across the board, not simply the folks who are stepping into that new space.
100%. And, if you even take it more broadly, is an impact to the organization. So I was such a fan. I mean, the school was an incredible school and a huge, strong sense of community. but I just volunteered for everything that I could volunteer for because like it was so me. I couldn't spend enough time there and give more of myself because it was such a beautiful, warm welcome as somebody who was brand new, who was unsure if we would, belong, if we would make friends, if they would make friends. Just having that little bit of extra attention meant so much that I did, volunteer for everything and donate and do the things that parents do at school for sure. I was excited to.
Yeah. I think that's such a wonderful part of it. And I think, on that note, maybe we can start to wind down the conversation because that's such a wonderful note, I think, to end on. I think I would love to just ask you a couple of final questions because I think in some ways this next question, you may have answered some of it because some of the work you do leads us there, but I'd love to just see where it shows up for you. But, as I think about this whole idea of desuckifying, and I think you make a great point. When I say desuckifying, I'm definitely thinking beyond the taking the suck out and thinking like, what do we do to help it become a really positive experience? So in your mind, if you had a magic wand, you could wave it and create this fully desuckified world of work for people, what does it look like?
So, if I had a magic wand and I had to start with one wish, my first wish would be for people to really feel a sense of connection and belonging. I mean, research on positive psychology and happiness, there's many pillars of well-being, but relationships are number one source of happiness, of well-being, of actually a physical health, mental health, like across the board. And right now there is such a crisis of loneliness and of disconnection. So if I had a magic wand, that's where I would start. I would create a workplace that prioritizes connection, prioritizes relationships, making time for each other, being there for each other, and bringing out the best in people so that they can bring their best selves to work and connect in that way. So, that's where I would wave my magic wand.
I love that. I think it connects so clearly to what we just talked about with how that onboarding process in places can immediately start to form some of those connections. And, it makes me wonder, I know we're sort of trying to wrap up here, but this thought comes up, and I know you've written about this a little bit. People, talk about, there's the remote and hybrid and in office. And I think in the remote and hybrid world, people maybe struggle a little bit with this idea of connection. I'm a big remote proponent, and I think there's ways to do it. Do you have any insight into what can help people forge those bonds in a remote setting?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something I've been thinking a lot about. I don't know if anybody has like, here's the playbook for that yet, right?
Yeah.
It's still emerging. Well, the data shows that people definitely want flexibility. That's like number one, like right there with meaningful work is meaningful work and flexibility. So people don't want to be mandated back to an office or whatnot. So they want flexibility, but they also want connection. And they're not getting, if they're getting one, they're not getting the other right now. And that's really tricky. And so what I have seen some organizations do successfully to try to start creating this connection, and what does it look like in a hybrid and distributed world. So one of the things is to create neighborhood or home-based teams, so that, let's say your headquarters is in New York, but you have a pocket of people in DC and a pocket of people in Austin, Texas, or whatever. And so leveraging those neighborhoods and creating systems for those people to connect with each other, whether it's creating what HubSpot does. It's a global ice cream day, and they want everybody to go have ice cream together, and they will give you a budget, and people will do it in the office if they're in the office, but in the neighborhoods. And if they're somewhere that where they have no coworkers,
Mm-hmm.
nearby, they will bring family members and friends and have ice
Yeah.
cream. So connecting
Okay.
that way.
Yeah.
Reddit is another distributed company, and they have budget for people to organize things, and it could be like a kayaking trip
Mm.
or whatever, so that people can still have autonomy, which is so big right now, in the
Yeah.
kinds of things that they want to do, but they have a budget and support and help organizing those things.
Yeah.
So that's one way that I see people do it successfully. Another way is if you are going to bring people together, whether it's like once a week in the office or twice a week, or whether it's like an offsite type thing, because and to be really intentional
Yeah.
about when the times that you are together, for
Mm-hmm.
the main goal there to be about connection
Yeah.
and relationship building.
Yeah, I can see that, right? Because I think maybe in the past some of those things were about understanding the state of the business and blah 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 blah, and maybe there's time for that. But if you're not giving people a chance to connect, you might come away from that offsite like, I feel like I barely talked to anybody. I feel like I just popped in and popped out. Versus if it's really immersive,
Yeah.
it's like, oh wow, it was only a weekend or a day, but I felt like I know everybody so much better. I can see that in a big way. And the other thing that I think about here is in the day to day, and this shows up for me as a coach and even somebody who managed a remote team previously, is just experimenting, like knowing that building community is a big goal, and it maybe needs you to be more intentional in a remote setting, just trying things, trying different ways of bringing people together, just doing, even if it's a Zoom call and it's not about work at all. It's just a chance for us to chat for an hour or whatever, like being willing to try things and learn as a leader what actually creates that connection. Some of it can be just simply giving people space to work together and not getting, micromanaging with them and letting them form their teams and alliances as they do. But I think that's
And
a
also,
process
like,
we're
I think
learning.
asking people, like, leaders don't have
Yeah.
to have all the answers. Like,
Yeah.
people know,
Yeah.
they know, they have ideas, they might
Mhm.
suggest something,
Yeah.
and so I think leveraging the
Mm.
expertise and the skills of the people who you hired for their expertise
That's a
and
great point.
experience,
I think it's
Uh,
yeah,
I
it's so
I
easy to
mean,
think we have the answers. Yeah.
so when like when people were starting to think about coming back to the office, kind
Mhm.
of back in 2020, maybe 2020, fall, winter
Fall, maybe.
2020,
Yeah.
um, I developed a framework to think about hybrid work cultures, and I
Mm.
call it third culture. It's a third culture.
Mm.
So it's based on work from a sociologist on third culture kids, and
Mm.
so they've studied kids that grow up in a culture that's not their primary culture.
Okay.
And so let's say your parents are Americans, and your passport is from the United States, but you grow up in France, for example,
Mhm.
because your dad might be a diplomat and might be there.
Right.
So they've studied these kids, and
Mhm.
and they found that they identify with this third culture, right? They are
Mm.
Americans, they're also French, they speak English and French, but
Mhm.
they don't feel 100% in one culture or another, but they
Mhm.
belong with each other. There's like this third culture that
Mm.
emerges between
Interesting.
them, and their lived experience is very similar to each
Yeah.
other. So I am a third culture
Oh,
kid,
okay.
because I'm from Brazil, born and raised, my family's there,
Okay.
but then I moved to the US in high school and moved back and came back. So,
Mhm.
and so it's this kind of liminal state that you
Mhm.
live in, right? Of
Yeah.
you belong nowhere, but you belong everywhere.
Mhm.
And so there's so much that we can learn from that research and that
Yeah.
experience of third culture kids to apply to hybrid workplaces.
Mhm.
And I think it just gives leaders another lens through
Mhm.
which to see that hybrid experience of one of opportunities. Yeah, it is hard,
Yeah.
and then there's challenges, but there's
Mhm.
also a lot of opportunities there. And how can you leverage what research says about third culture kids to
Mhm.
intentionally create a culture, a hybrid culture that enables people to thrive?
Yeah. I think that's a really important thing. And I think that idea that, like, we're still figuring this out. So wherever there's a data point, whatever that is, whether it's from this third culture research or if it's from, certain organizations, maybe some of these exemplar organizations are starting to see results from certain practices. Because I think, and I'm guilty of this at times when I see somebody kind of just being very authoritarian about like, get back to the office. Like, I'm very frustrated by it, but I also understand it's coming from fear and it's coming from not knowing. And it's like, I want to go back to what I know because that's comfortable. And I think that's a natural state for a lot of human beings. We want to have at least a foundation that we can feel comfortable in, and then we can grow from there. So the more we can arm people with information and studies and stories from other companies and organizations that are doing this well, the more people might be willing to step out and go, okay, I'm willing to try this because I think there's things we can stand on versus just feeling like there's no foundation there.
Yeah, I agree completely.
Well, the other question I like to ask people, and I know I told you about this ahead of time, is I use sound effects a lot in my mostly in my intro and outro. And if you've watched or listened to the podcast, you'll hear cat sounds and usually some other random sounds, which are some of the other guests making sounds, and it can be super silly, goofy. It doesn't have to mean anything. So do you have any sounds you'd be willing to share with us today?
Yeah. So this question really stumped me. I'm like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? Like, I don't access my creativity through sound much. It's mostly through words. So the best that I could come up with is a big sigh. Like, like the feeling of relief, recognition, of belonging when you're comfortable, you can be yourself, but also like, we've arrived at this magical destination where work is really meaningful. So not super exciting, but
that's okay.
Meaningful nonetheless.
It's very meaningful and it's very relatable. And it's one of those, I know there's probably a word for this, but like when you hear it, you feel it.
Yeah.
Meaning immediately it like drains some of the anxiety out of you to simply even hear a sigh. And then when you do actually sigh, I don't know where that comes from in our body, but we must be holding on to something. It's like too much carbon dioxide or something. And we get rid of it. And suddenly the body feels released. Right. So I think that's wonderful. I love it. There's so much communicated through that. That's great. I think that's definitely a fully desuckified sound effect, and it will show up somewhere in the intro and or outro of our episode, no doubt. So
I was worried that I wasn't going to bring the best sound effect.
I love that. I love that. That one's fantastic. Obviously would love to give people a chance to connect with you and the work you're doing. So what are the best ways to find you online?
Best way to find me is on LinkedIn. I post a ton of, my own research, but other research that I read in stories and practical ideas. That's where I spend most of my online time. Also on Instagram. It's Tamara Myles for both.
Okay.
And I also have a website, which is just tamaramyles.com.
Nice. Well, I think those are nice, easy ways to connect, and I can certainly vouch for the LinkedIn. I mean, we're connected on LinkedIn. I'm always appreciative of the stuff you post. It just feeds my desire for like a combination of hope. I'm always looking for like where is the hope as we're sort of in this state of flux in the world of work, and then you always have these kind of tangible things, whether it's a practice or a bit of research or something that you can not just feel like, oh, this is a dreamer kind of a statement, but it's actually a statement that's got something I can hang on to. So very much recommend everybody following you and finding hope and real possibility in the words that you share frequently on there.
Thank you. That means a lot. That's exactly what I try to do. And possibility is my favorite word. So I love that you use that to describe. Thank you.
That is one of my favorite words as well. And I think people will follow you, and also that will give them a chance to learn more about the book that's coming out next year as that slowly starts to build towards completion. Can you reveal anything about what that book is focused on?
It's focused on the leadership practices that make work meaningful. So
Okay.
based on our research and
Awesome.
our 3 C's framework.
Oh, I
And
love it.
it's full of practical ideas, tons of
Mhm.
stories that bring these ideas to life.
Mhm.
And I'm co-authoring it with Wes, who's my research partner, friend, and
Nice.
business partner.
Mhm.
And we have so many wonderful organizations and leaders represented. We are really excited.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to that as well as just everything else that you're putting out into the world.
Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate you having me, and this
Yeah.
conversation was great.
Yeah, it was really fun. Well, thanks, Tamara. I really appreciate it as well. And look forward to just staying in touch and seeing what else you do.
Thank you. I look forward to
Awesome.
staying in touch too.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone, for tuning in to the DesuckifyWork Podcast. And thanks to Tamara for bringing deep insight and delightful wisdom to our conversation. You can follow Tamara on LinkedIn and check out her site at tamaramyles.com. And put a note in your calendar for early 2025 so you can grab a copy of her new book. I put it on mine in all caps because I won't listen to myself unless I'm shouting. Speaking of shouting, you should give me a shout if you'd like to learn more about the work I do. We can set up a free half-hour "What the heck is coaching all about" session. I promise I'll keep the volume at a reasonable level. Bye, everyone!